Hey everybody, welcome back to my Journey to the Bible. And if you're new to the channel, I'm just really glad you're here. I think it's awesome. One of the things that I really enjoy about doing these videos is that we're not trying to have everything figured out, right? We're just kind of walking through this together. And I'm still learning. I'm still, excuse me, still asking questions. And there's still times when I read something in the Bible and I think, okay, Lord, I know what that says, but what does that actually look like in my life? And I think today's passage, is one of those. Because today we're going to look at just two verses, Romans 12, 1 and 2. It's only two verses, but there's a whole lot packed into them. And I think they get to the heart of what we're talking about in this episode, and that's our need for control. So maybe you're just beginning to explore what it means to follow Jesus, or maybe you've called yourself a Christian for a long time, but lately you've started taking another look at your faith and asking, what does it really mean to give my life to Jesus? What does that even mean? If that's you, this episode I think is especially for you. Last week we talked about transformation, how God changes us and why sometimes that change can be difficult, right? But that got me thinking, if Jesus is going to change my life, if I'm asking God to change my life, at some point I have to be willing to give him my life, right? And that's where we run into a word that can sound intimidating, and that is surrender. Now, I'll be honest, surrender doesn't exactly sound like good news, does it? When somebody surrenders, that means they've lost, or the battle's over. Wave the white flag because you've given up. So when somebody says that you need to surrender your life to Jesus, I think it's fair to ask, what exactly does that mean? To surrender your life to Jesus? Does it mean I'm giving up everything I enjoy, or does God want to take things away from me? Do I have to become a completely different person? Because if I'm going to give my life to someone, there's a pretty important question I think I need answered first, and that is, can I trust him? Can I trust the person that I'm giving my life over to? And that's why I love what Paul writes in Romans 12. It's only two verses, like I said earlier, but I think there's a lot here. So let's take a look at Romans 12. If you have your Bibles, it's Romans 12, 1 and 2. And in verse 1, he says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." And then in verse 2, he says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." So I want to slow down on this because I don't want us to miss anything, because there's so much in here, what Paul has to tell us here. So let's just take it a piece at a time. Let's start with that first word, therefore. Now, whenever we see something, or whenever we see therefore in the Bible, I think we need to ask, what is it there for? And I know that's an old one, but it still works, right? Paul has spent the chapters before this talking about what God has done for us. And that's grace, mercy, forgiveness, our salvation. And then he says, therefore. In other words, because of everything God has done for you and for me, this is how we can respond. And I think that's important, because Christianity, it doesn't begin with give God enough and maybe he'll love you. It begins with what God has already done for us, right? And that changes the way that we should look at surrender. See, I'm not surrendering, or we're not surrendering our lives to Jesus so he'll love us. I'm learning to surrender because he already does. So let's look at the next part of this verse. He says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy." So he's saying, in view of God's mercy. I love this, because before Paul tells me, or tells us, to give God anything, he points us towards God's mercy. And just as a quick reminder, we've talked about mercy in videos before this. Mercy is God not giving me the judgment that I deserve, right? And grace is God giving me what I don't deserve. See, mercy would say, I won't give you what your sin has earned. But grace would say, I'm going to give you something you could never earn. And that would be love, forgiveness, and maybe Jesus saying a relationship with me, right? So when Paul says, in view of God's mercy, he's basically saying, before you think about what God is asking from you, let's just remember what he's already done for you or for us, right? And I think that's important, especially when we're talking about surrender. Because I'm not surrendering, or we're not surrendering to an angry God who's waiting for us to mess up. We're surrendering to a merciful God who already knows that we have and loved us anyway. He loved us enough to send Jesus, right? Even though he knew we would mess up, even knowing that we were the sinners that we were, he sent Jesus anyway. So let's look at the next part of the verse. He says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies. So what is he saying? Offer your bodies, right? Paul makes this very practical, I think. He's talking about giving God our actual lives, our time, relationships, habits, decisions or plans, maybe our future, right? Even the parts where we really don't want God's opinion. Because sometimes I know my prayer can sound like this: Lord, my life belongs to you. You can have everything, Lord. Well, everything except for this, because I've got this one, God, and I'll call you if this gets out of hand. Well, you know what usually happens? That's the one that gets out of hand. But here's something important. If you're just beginning this journey, if God isn't, I should say, God isn't waiting for you to get everything cleaned up first. He doesn't want us to be, we're not going to be perfect. We're not supposed to clean ourselves up. We're supposed to just come to him the way we are. See, you don't have to fix yourself first. You don't have to understand the whole Bible first. You don't have to suddenly become some perfect Christian. You start by just coming to Jesus. And then you begin learning to trust him with the different parts of your life, right? Surrender, I guess surrender isn't saying, Jesus, look how good I've become. It's saying, Jesus, here I am. So now he says that in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. A living sacrifice. Okay, so that phrase is interesting if you think about it. A living sacrifice. In the Old Testament, a sacrifice was placed on an altar, right? But Paul says we're supposed to become a living sacrifice. That's a problem if you think about it, because with a living sacrifice, it can crawl back off the altar, can't it? I can wake up in the morning and say, God, today belongs to you. And then it seems like sometimes by lunchtime, okay, Lord, thanks, I'll take it from here. I surrender my worry, and then I pick it back up. I surrender a situation, right? And then I spend 3 hours figuring out how I'm going to control it. Sometimes I'll surrender my future, and I'll surrender my future, I guess, until something happens that wasn't part of my plan. Maybe you've done that too, I don't know, but here's the hope in this. Learning to surrender doesn't mean you're going to do it perfectly. Sometimes surrender looks like, God, I give this to you. Or, God, I gave this to you yesterday, and apparently I took it back. So here it is again, God. And tomorrow, maybe I'll have to do that again. See, we're only learning to trust, and trust grows. So let's look at what's next. Okay, so he says to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. I like this part, because what he's saying, this is your true and proper worship. When I hear worship, and maybe this is you too, I usually think about singing. I think about in church, before the message, the band comes out, or they'll do hymns, whatever your church does, but you're worshiping prior to the message. That's what I think about when I think about worship. But Paul shows us something bigger, doesn't he? Giving my life to God is worship. When I say, God, I don't understand this, but I'm going to trust you, that's worship. Or when I say, this isn't what I wanted, but I'm going to keep following you, Lord, That's worship. When I'm afraid and everything inside of me wants to grab that control back, but I say, God, I'm putting this into your hands. That's worship. Sometimes the greatest worship that I give God or we give God doesn't come out of our mouths. It's what I'm willing to place in his hands. I love that. So now we move on to chapter 12, verse 2. And he says, do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Okay, so do not conform to the pattern of this world, right? Now we begin to see why surrender can be so difficult. Because almost everything around us tells us the opposite, doesn't it? The world says, hey, you need to take control, or follow your heart. Do whatever makes you happy. That's what we're told. You know what's best for your life. And then Jesus comes along and he says, trust me and follow me. Well, that's different, right? Because one says, I'm in charge, and the other says that Jesus is. And that's where the struggle begins. Because surrender means I'm giving up something that most of us really enjoy. And what is that? We talked about it earlier, right? Control. And I don't know about you, but I like control. Even when I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, I'd still like to be in charge. But maybe surrender isn't losing control. Maybe it's finally admitting something. And that is that I never had as much control as I thought I did. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, is what he said, but read the rest of it now. It says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Or let's just take that, be transformed, right? There's that word again, transformed. Remember last week we talked about transformation. I think there's a connection here that we shouldn't miss. Transformation and surrender, they go together. Because how can I ask Jesus to transform something that I refuse to give him? God, change my life, but don't change that, okay, God? Or God, lead me, but I want to choose the destination. God, I trust you as long as you do what I think you should do. That is not surrender. But I've done that. I've done that a ton. But again, that's not really surrender. That's asking God to ride along while I'm driving. We're asking God to be a passenger, right? He says, do not conform to the pattern of the world, but be transformed. By what? By the renewing of your mind. The renewing of your mind. Here's something I really want someone who's new to faith to understand. Following Jesus, it's not simply about learning a bunch of religious rules. See, God begins changing the way that we think. I start moving from, hey, I know what's best, to, well, maybe God knows something I don't, right? Or from, I've got to control this, to, I'm learning to trust God with this. Or, what if God's plans isn't what I want? Well, what if God's plan is better than what I'm desperately trying to hold on to? And that doesn't happen overnight. I mean, our minds are renewed as we spend time with God. We spend time in his word, or when we're praying, or as we learn to recognize the work of the Holy Spirit. As we spend time around other people who are following Jesus, right? It's a journey. It's a journey. And if you're at the beginning of that journey right now, don't become discouraged because you haven't figured everything out. None of us have. The important thing is that you're walking. So let's look at what Paul says next, right? He says, do not conform to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Now look, I've prayed this plenty of times. God, just show me your will. But lately I've had to ask myself another question. Do I really want God's will? Or do I want God to approve mine? There's a difference, right? Sometimes I'm asking God what to do. Or, no, I guess better would be, I'm asking God what do you want me to do, right? But somewhere inside I'm thinking, and here's the answer I'm hoping you're going to give me. Maybe before I ask God, what is your will, I need to pray, God, whatever your will is, help me to surrender mine, right? So let's talk about what we've gone over tonight. A quick summary of Romans 12, 1 and 2. See, it reminds us, that surrender isn't about earning God's love. That's not what this is about. It's about my response to the love and mercy he's already shown me. If I give my life, if I give him my life and I learn to let go of the control that I have, and he renews my mind, and I begin to trust his will instead of always trying to force my own, that's surrender. And I don't think anybody shows us really what surrender looks like better than Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? In Gethsemane. The night before Jesus died, the night before he was crucified, Jesus knew what was coming. He knew the suffering ahead of him. But listen to his prayer in Luke 22:42. He says, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. I love the honesty of that. Jesus didn't pretend it wasn't painful. He didn't pretend he wanted to suffer. He said, Father, if there's another way. But then, not my will, but yours. That's surrender. Surrender doesn't mean that I don't have desires. It doesn't mean that we're never afraid. It doesn't mean that something doesn't hurt. It doesn't even mean that I understand what God is doing. Surrender is just being honest with God about what I want and still saying, Father, I trust you more than I trust me. So what does surrender look like? Maybe surrender isn't saying, God, I don't care what happens. Maybe it's saying, God, I care deeply about what happens, but I'm learning to trust you with the outcome. That's hope. Surrender doesn't mean I figured everything out or that we figured everything out. It doesn't mean I'll never be afraid. It doesn't even mean I'll never grab the steering wheel back. It means I'm beginning to believe that Jesus can be trusted with my life. So maybe today surrender for you is your marriage, or maybe it's your children. Maybe it's your future or your fear, your past, a relationship, a decision. Maybe it's something you've been trying desperately to control. Whatever it is, surrender isn't giving up. It's giving over. And maybe that's where you begin, maybe with a prayer. Maybe just pray this. Jesus, I don't completely understand this yet. I don't know exactly where you're taking me, but I want to know you, and I'm willing to begin trusting you with my life. That's a prayer that we can just pray, and maybe God will begin to work in our life and begin to show us surrender. And if tomorrow you take something back, give it to him again. Keep walking, keep learning, keep getting to know Jesus, because the more I know him, the more I'm discovering that surrender isn't giving my life away to someone who wants to take something from me. It's placing my life into the hands of someone who gave his life for me. Man, I hope you got something from Romans like I did. I just love that. Romans 12, 1 and 2. So next week, let's talk about that. Because I think tonight leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? If I surrender my life to Jesus, now what? What does it actually look like to follow Jesus, right? Not just believe he exists, not just go to church, not just call myself a Christian. What does following Jesus look like on a regular Tuesday morning? When I go to work, when I'm with my family, when somebody gets on my nerves, which happens, when I have discussions or decisions to make, when I mess up, when life doesn't go the way I planned it, right? See, Jesus walked up to ordinary people and gave them a simple invitation. Follow me. But what did he actually mean? Well, that's where we're going in episode 8. We're going to look at what it really means to follow Jesus. And I think we're going to discover that it's both simpler and more challenging than we sometimes make it. Until then, maybe don't worry about having the whole journey figured out. Just ask yourself, who has the steering wheel? And I'll see you next time. Thanks for being here.